If it isn't really obvious enough after the last couple of videos, I absolutely love Sekiro, but that doesn't mean that the game isn't flawless. Oh no, far from it. And we're gonna talk about those flaws today because From Software isn't amongst the great immortal gods of game developers, and there are many things in this game that they really need to fix. Welcome to appabendyt's Uncapped, the series of reviews by yours truly. Today's review is gonna be on Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, my favorite game of this year that isn't all without its flaws. But before I get to the flaws, I want to say huge thanks for liking and sharing my videos, subscribing and following me on social media, and for supporting me on Patreon, PayPal, and many other means. Links down below. Sekiro's story takes place in the closing years of the Sengoku era. You are playing as Wolf or Okami or Sekiro or whatever nickname is convenient for our main character that day. After the war is seemingly over, the great shinobi Owl took notice of the stray wolf who has nothing else to lose for, so he decided to adopt him and train him to become another great shinobi. From there, he's given a task to serve Lord Kuro and protect him at all costs, but he failed on the hands of Genichiro Ashina, the grandson of Isshin Ashina, who is seeking the dragon heritage in Kuro's blood to gain immortality and protect the Ashina heritage. Sekiro lost his left arm and is being replaced by a prosthetic one by the old sculptor, who was revealed to be a former shinobi himself. Ever since then, he's going to do whatever it takes to get Lord Kuro back and prevent anyone from using his dragon heritage in order to seek immortality. The story is pretty minimalistic in terms of its presentation, and thanks to the structure of the gameplay, which consists of you dying and dying over and over again, you're probably gonna end up not being able to follow through what's going on with the plot, not because the plot is complicating, but because you're too busy following the story of how Wolf got his ass kicked by the ogre demon over and over again. It's kind of like being told about a children's fairy tale story while being beaten down by bullies. In result, you kind of forgot what happened in the main plot and why certain characters have to do certain things. Not that the main plot is interesting or intriguing to begin with, it's a simple story about a guy who seeks immortality and you have to stop him. There isn't really anything new here, and it sounds like the plot of a 50s samurai film. I treat the story in this game the same way I treat the story in action films in general. They're there, but they're not really gonna be the main meat of the feast, and you shouldn't really be paying too much attention to it. That being said, From Software has always been excellent in terms of its environmental storytelling, and this game is no exception. There are so many things around the world of Sekiro that just truly fascinates me. The monks who have gone corrupt, the giant serpents guarding the valley, the Wu guys striking unaware enemies from afar, the mysterious surgeon in the abandoned dungeon, that really weird guy under the bridge early on. I love how there are so many interesting stories that you uncover to play this game and getting through the game's environment. It's a shame that the main story isn't getting the same well-presented treatment, but at least there's something to enjoy in exploring the world of Sekiro and uncovering the fascinating side stories around. This is compounded very well with the game's really beautiful environments, not as varying as Dark Souls environments, but still beautiful nonetheless. The early areas of the game are incredibly stunning to look at. I particularly really love the mountain areas in the middle parts of the game and the Fountainhead Palace that feels really inviting, but at the same time introduces projectile enemies that would choke down half your health bars. It creates a really nice sense of false comfort, unlike your typical Soulsborne game where the environments are dirty and depressing throughout. What also really helps the environmental beauty and its storytelling was the level design. The Ashina outskirts area are seemingly pretty linear, but once you keep exploring through the areas, you'll find out that there are alternative ways that might lead you into other really interesting places, like a way that goes straight to the Demon Bell, which increases the difficulty of the game even more if you're into that sort of thing. Even the seemingly linear Hirata estate is able to provide secret areas and places that would net you tons and tons of benefits. Exploration is heavily rewarded in this game, and you might find tons of things that you haven't found when you first stumble upon the area. And now let's talk about the combat system in the game, which is radically different from a typical Souls game. Now, unlike the Souls game, you're not going to be playing whatever characters or classes that you want. You're just going to be stuck playing as Wolf. Not only that, but you don't get access to better weapons. You're stuck with your default sword and a couple of prosthetics, and you're only going to be able to increase the attack power of your sword or add new techniques as you progress to the game. And unlike a typical Souls game, the game relies less on dodging and more on deflection and posture. I mean, sure, there are times where I have to dodge the bosses, but deflection and posture are more important to manage if you fight through the tough bosses later on. The posture essentially highlights the damage on your defense, and if it's full, it means that you or the enemies have successfully broken it, and you or the enemies are vulnerable to attacks. You can keep damaging the posture either by deflecting your enemy, which you can perform by pressing the block button just at the right time where the enemy attacks, kind of like parrying in Dark Souls. You also need to perform a death blow for the bosses as you reduce either their posture or their health bar, and you need to perform 2 or sometimes even 3 death blows to defeat the boss. I absolutely adore this combat system. This is a combat system that actually requires skill, timing, and precision. I feel like the deflection mechanics is basically the parry mechanics from Dark Souls, except you have a significantly longer window to perform it, which does make it sound easier than parrying in Dark Souls, but it doesn't mean that it's not difficult to deflect or counter a lot of the game's really fast bosses. It is still really challenging, and mastering deflection and the many counter mechanics in the game is key in mastering this game. The game also does something really interesting in terms of its health and weapon damage upgrades. Now, you still get XP and money as you kill your enemies, but your XP only gets you new techniques and skills rather than direct upgrades to your health or damage. If you want to increase your health bar, you need to collect prayer beads. Some prayer beads are scattered throughout the world, but you gain most of them by fighting the mini bosses of the game. As for increasing your damage, you need to fight the main bosses of the game and gather their memories so that you can increase your attack power. There is a way to convert skill points to attack power, but that happens very late in the game and requires you to gather tons and tons of materials, and it's not necessary to beat the game. So what does this mean for the average Souls player? Well, to me at least, it means that there's really no use of grinding enemies for XP like in Dark Souls. You can get the most essential skills very early on in the game, such as the Mikiri counter, which is very useful for a lot of boss fights. The rest of the skills aren't really that useful in my opinion. Regaining health from death blowing enemies is pretty useful. Additional posture damage is nice. More efficient healing items is nice too. But the rest of the game's techniques, other than spinning attack that you get early on, are really not that useful, at least to my playstyle. So when the game says that you're gonna be losing XP and money after you die, I say, well, I don't really need those lost XPs anyway, especially when the game saves the skill points after a certain threshold. And yes, by the way, the game saves the skill points after a certain threshold. If you have 2 skill points in your hand, that's permanent, at least until you spend them. The only thing that you'll be losing once you die is half of the XP progress that you gain to have 3 skill points. The other 2 skill points will never be lost. Oh, and speaking of death, there's an unseen aid mechanic where an up to 30% chance you don't get to lose your XP and money, but you do get to spread the dragon rot disease towards the NPCs every time you die. The disease will make them feel sick, which will prevent you from doing business or certain quests, and can even potentially kill them as far as I know, but I haven't reached a point where that happened, so maybe it didn't. I feel like that this mechanic is more of an annoyance because I ended up having tons of dragon's blood droplet, which you can use to cure the disease. Not only that, but a single dragon's blood droplet pretty much cures everyone who has the disease and returns the unseen aid chance to 30%. So you can just die as many times as you want, and if the NPC that you need is sick, just cure them. I have plenty of dragon's blood droplets. It's a rather annoying mechanic, and I don't really need the unseen aid anyway, as it gives me better chance of regaining things that I don't really need to be regained after death. What I need is better damage and more prayer beads, things that I can get when I defeat the bosses. This means that the game practically says that it's perfectly fine for you to die over and over and over again, as the consequences are very little. Unlike Dark Souls, where your souls are precious for your character upgrades and you don't want to lose them in the next fight, the money, or the cents as the game called them, and the XP are not really that useful in my opinion. It rewards the players to be more reckless rather than careful, because in Dark Souls, the loss of those souls can lead to hours upon hours of XP gaining rendered worthless. To put it simply, Sekiro doesn't punish you enough for dying, which kind of makes sense in terms of the game's overall theme of immortality and resurrection, but compared to Dark Souls, I can confidently say that this is one of the many mechanics of the game that makes this game to feel easier than Dark Souls. Some might see this as a negative because anything easier than Dark Souls is absolute heresy, but I kind of see this as a positive, not because it's not as punishing, because I complain about that, but because it means that the game focuses more on punishing the player through fast-paced and skillful combat, instead of punishing the player because they couldn't reach their lost souls in time and wasting hours upon hours of grinding. Oh, and by the way, the game allows you to save your money as well by purchasing the coin purses from the merchants. These coin purses are also scattered throughout the map. Now, the game does have merchants, but I find it really interesting that they sell very limited amounts of coin purses. I find it utterly ridiculous that a merchant is able to sell really powerful items infinitely, but not pieces of cloth that stores money. Oh no, that item is very rare in this universe. I've gone through this entire review without talking about the prosthetics, and to be honest, I have never used it. Even though these prosthetics can be useful for certain things, I ended up not using them at all. There was even a time where I could upgrade a lot of the prosthetics in the game because I got the resources that I need, but I didn't upgrade them because I don't use the prosthetics that much and I don't care to upgrade. There are times where they are useful, but the spirit emblems are basically sitting there doing nothing, especially in boss fights, unless if I want the puppet ninjutsu, which is surprisingly useful to distract certain enemies and your puppets are seemingly unkillable. And speaking of boss fights, considering that you don't always need to fight the standard enemies to gain the necessary health and damage upgrades, you can turn this game into a boss rush game instead of a proper Souls game. So the comparison to Cuphead is rather apt if you ask me. And just like Cuphead, I love the boss fights. They are really damn good. They actually require skill, precision, and talent. The boss fights in the game do make you feel like a badass once you figure out their attack patterns and kill them. But that being said, the mini bosses do need some variety because they're really lacking on it. There are times where the game straight up repeats the mini bosses or even some main bosses. There are even some bosses that are so ridiculously easy that the only reason the game counts them as bosses is because they're necessary to progress the plot. That monkey boss is just a time waster if you ask me, and the Divine Dragon boss fight is easier than taking a dump. But aside from those, the rest of the boss fights actually demand skill, and I absolutely love them. Now let's talk about the PC port. I've gained mixed reports on the PC port of this game, which is really odd because I'm running this game just fine on my overclocked GTX 1050 laptop at 1080p. It's not a consistent 60 FPS for sure, but compared to the locked 30 FPS on PS4, I'll take this any day. People are reporting issues running this game on a second monitor, but I'm running this game just fine on a second monitor as long as you make that as your primary monitor. I did have issues with the PS4 controller not responding to any of my inputs when I started the game, even when I'm using DS4 Windows, which converts the PS4 inputs to Xbox inputs, but after turning off the VJoy device that I had on my device manager for connecting the Joy-Cons to the PC, the PS4 controller works fine using DS4 Windows. It doesn't support it natively, but then again, you can also change the button prompts in the PC version so that it might look like you're playing the PS4 version. While this isn't really a bad PC port, it does lack a lot of the options that PC gamers need, like unlocking your frame rate or ultra widescreen options. You can do that through mods because this is PC gaming and you can do so much on PC gaming, and putting this game on SSD ensures really fast loading, something that Bloodborne has a little bit of trouble with. Overall, Sekiro is a game with so many flaws, but it is definitely one of my favorite games of this year. Hell, it could even be in my top 10 favorites of all time because I honestly couldn't recall a game where I'm so invested with the gameplay so much that I want to get better at it, I want to improve, and I want to be good at this game. It's a really fun, really challenging, and very skillful game. Sure, the setting is beautiful but lacking variety. Sure, the environmental storytelling was presented well, but the main story isn't. Sure, the game doesn't really punish you enough for dying over and over and over again, but the core of the game is the skillful, posture-based combat mechanics that works really damn well and incredibly fun to play. Highly, highly recommended. And this is coming from someone who isn't a Soulsborne fan. Good job once again from Software.